Good morning. We have a couple of items on the agenda today at this press conference. First, want to discuss a little bit of our legislative priorities in the session, how those went, what we're hoping to achieve in the future, and then I want to share the conclusion of our investigation into Weston County Clerk Becky Hadlock. Well, it was 2.5 months ago when we presented our conservative election integrity agenda to ensure that we would advance real election integrity reforms now that we have a true conservative majority in the Wyoming State House. And I'm pleased to report that 60% of our priorities have passed the legislature and are either on the governor's desk or have been signed. And that is led by a landmark reform, proof of citizenship and proof of residency for voting in additional to a durational residency requirement. That is House Bill 156. And let's go through these priorities. And these are key priorities at the national level of President Trump in the election integrity sphere. One was requiring proof of citizenship and residency for registering to vote. That was our number one priority, and that sits on the governor's desk. Two was banning ballot drop boxes in the state of Wyoming, and that failed on committee of the whole on the last day for bills to be heard in second reading in the second house. And it was the leadership of the Senate that refused to hear 7 election integrity bills that died on the final day for hearing bills in the second house. And that was actually 7 of the 15 bills that died that evening. Number 3, strengthening Wyoming's voter ID statute. And this is so common sense, just like all these election integrity priorities. 1, requiring photo ID for voter ID. And one of the weaknesses in our initial voter ID statute was that there were some IDs on the initial list that did not require a photo. We wanted to put that requirement into state law for a photo and then remove from the list IDs that did not have a photo. Because when you think about it, voter ID, the whole point of it, what you're trying to effectuate is stopping voter impersonation. And when you have a photo on the ID, you can't stop the impersonation because there's no photo on the ID. So it's a very common sense piece of legislation that unfortunately died on committee of the whole, the second house, and then House Bill 160, which was removing these student IDs from the list of acceptable identifications. Of course, student IDs can be issued to foreign nationals. There's really not procedures around them, certainly not in the election code. I was going through some of the things I had in my house today, and I found my high school ID from 20 years ago. And under the statute, that could be used for voter ID. So that was House Bill 160 was another bill that would strengthen election integrity that unfortunately died on committee of the whole. And all these bills went through the state house. I want to emphasize that. Every single one of our election integrity priorities went through that conservative majority in the state house, and 60% ultimately went through the state Senate. 4th was banning ballot harvesting, House Bill 238. We're one of the few states that does not, in the election code, ban ballot harvesting, and that's really troubling because ballot harvesting removes the chain of custody from the ballot, just like drop boxes do. And that was another one that died with the bloodbath on February 28th. Number 5, imposing a durational residency requirement to vote in Wyoming, and that was incorporated into House Bill 156. So that was achieved, and that is sitting on the governor's desk. Now let me talk a little bit about House Bill 156. Of course, the governor vetoed our common sense rules last year that would require proof of residency to register to vote, and then also proof of citizenship in not allowing non-resident designations on IDs, which are what residents that are not citizens have on Wyoming IDs. This is common sense. And unfortunately, this governor vetoed that common sense rulemaking in 2024. He did it the very same day that President Trump was announcing the SAVE Act at Mar-a-Lago with Speaker Johnson. And of course, the SAVE Act is providing for proof of citizenship for registering to vote, and made its way through the House and in the 24th session. and is a key priority of President Trump's, and we're hoping that it is brought again in the 25 session, and it makes its way through the House, and then hopefully the Senate to the President's desk, where now it will be signed, unlike last year. And what we're trying to do is to provide for proof of citizenship at the state level, which is what we're trying to do at the federal level with the SAVE Act, a key priority of President Trump's. We're trying to have that requirement at the state level. And we would be the first state in the nation, if this passed, that requires proof of citizenship for all races, because we have an NVRA exemption. The states that do not have an NVRA exemption, that have proof of citizenship, have to exempt out their federal races. And there's 6 states that have an NVRA exemption. Wyoming's one of them, and we'd be the first state in the nation that would have a proof of citizenship requirement for all races. The House Bill 156 is a common sense piece of legislation. It's sitting on the governor's desk. It's interesting because he had a 72-hour deadline on Thursday. He could have signed it on Thursday. I mean, the deadline elapsed at 11:59, and the legislature adjourned at 4 p.m., so the clock resets to the 15 days required in the Constitution. But this is really common sense, and it's conservative election integrity reform, and it should be signed. It also, as we mentioned, the 5th priority requires a durational residency requirement for registering to vote. Now, I hope you're aficionados of the Wyoming State Constitution. Our Constitution had a 1-year residency requirement for registering to vote that was invalidated in a series of cases in the 70s. And since then, the legislature has declined to act to set a durational residency requirement in the election code that would survive constitutional scrutiny. So here we are sitting where somebody could be here for 10 seconds. There's no requirement that somebody reside in the state for a certain period of time before registering to vote. You simply need to be, quote, a bona fide resident. Bona fide meaning genuine. So this would put into place the strongest durational residency requirement that has survived constitutional scrutiny since the early 1970s, and it's also common sense. Priority number 6, banning Zuck bucks in Wyoming, banning the private funding of elections in Wyoming. Now, there's 28 states that have done this. Almost every single red state has done this except Wyoming. We need to get this to the finish line. We were very close in 24, passed unanimously in the Joint Committee, and with huge majorities in the State House and the State Senate. It also sits on the governor's desk, and for all the media that says this never happens here, there's never any issue, we see once again that the troika, what I call the troika, the legacy media, the insiders, and the Democrats are wrong, because we saw the Center for Tech and Civic Life attempt to, had a booth at the county officers meeting in Rock Springs in September. And that shows that we're being targeted right now because we're one of the few states that hasn't banned Zuck bucks, hasn't banned this third-party interference in elections, which also makes us vulnerable to foreign funding because some of these conduits appear to have foreign funds in them as well. Priority number 7, instituting voter list maintenance to ensure clean voter rolls, House Bill 318. That passed both houses. I always say voter list hygiene. Just like we need to brush our teeth every day, hopefully twice a day, we need to have good practices, good voter list hygiene. And this places into the code strong voter list procedures that other states have. The 8th priority was paper ballots, House Bill 245, where it would require pen-to-paper ballots for voting. And President Trump talked about this just the other day, about the need for executive action upon this, and we agree with him. And unfortunately, the one county that, as a default, does not use pen-to-paper ballots is the county we are currently in, Laramie County, which has the highest number of qualified electors. Instead, they use a touchscreen ballot system, which prints out a ballot, and contrary to some of the testimony that was heard during the session, it is not the names printed on the ballot that cast the ballot in Laramie County when the touchscreens are used. Rather, it is the barcodes on the top. So all we wanted was to have as the default method of voting, and we ensured that we'd follow federal law on this, have proper exemptions, but that the default would be pen to paper ballots, which has overwhelming support. Fortunately, that one failed. That one was not referred from the Senate President's desk. Priority number 9, banning ranked choice voting in the state of Wyoming, House Bill 165. That has passed both houses with large majorities and is sitting on the governor's desk. And then priority number 10, banning foreign funding of elections and ballot measures, closing the loophole in federal law that with a really troubling FEC decision, they said that federal law does not ban the foreign funding of ballot measures, and that's very disturbing. That's a loophole that we need to close, and there's been a movement state to state while we're hoping for federal action to close that loophole at the state level, and that's what we did in House Bill 337. That is the one that the governor signed so far. And we're waiting for action. The dither and delay is really disturbing on these issues, but 337 is the one we got action on, and Wyoming is now the second state in the nation to ban the foreign funding of elections and ballot measures. So those were our 10 priorities. And you see here, one of them was already signed into law, and then there are 5 others that are sitting on the governor's desk. Priority number 1 and priority number 5, which are incorporated into House Bill 156, priority number 6, which is in House Bill 228, priority number 7, which is in House Bill 318, and then priority number 9, which is in House Bill 165. I just want to get it straight because the media, it's been interesting, that 60% has passed, and some of the figures have kind of not aligned with reality. I am disappointed by the failure of these 7 election integrity bills in the Senate on February 28th. And I think it shows the weakness of the Senate leadership. I'm really disappointed in the Senate leadership on this. Majority Floor Leader Nethercott and the Senate President Bill Biden. A number of these bills were also held in the Senate President's desk. For example, the original version of proof of citizenship for voting, House Bill 157, House Bill 245, paper ballots, and then also a hand recount measure. I believe that was House Bill 232 that sat in the President's desk, and instead they said, well, we passed an election omnibus bill that went over to the House. The problem with omnibus bills is that in one fell swoop, the governor can veto an omnibus bill. The other problem is that omnibus bills are very easy to weaken. When you have multiple things in a bill, it becomes very easy to divert from a central topic. And that's what happened over in the Senate, where the pen and paper ballot provision in the omnibus bill was weakened, and then also the recount provision in the omnibus bill was weakened. So the omnibus approach, and then also, of course, the omnibus approach has constitutional issues. Bills are supposed to be single subject in Wyoming. And that's why I think that the House really emphasized this approach of having one topic to each bill, which is in line with the requirements of the Wyoming State Constitution. That being said, I'm very thrilled that 60% of our priorities have passed the legislature. We are going to continue to work on every single one of these bills that failed during the interim. One of the interim topics we requested was every single election integrity bill that failed. We asked the Joint Corporations Committee to take them up, and I'm hoping at their first meeting, which has already been announced for May 5th and 6th in Lander, that we are able to run through every single one that failed, and then the committee can consider whether to take a bill draft motion, which would allow the bill to be drafted and proceed to the next meeting. Now, one other thing I want to say about House Bill 156, proof of citizenship and residency to vote, and I hope this is imparted to the governor. Scott Rasmussen just came out with a poll last week. 91% of Americans support proof of citizenship for registering to vote. This is common sense. Now, I want to transition into the conclusion of our investigation of the Weston County Clerk, Becky Hadlock, which is the second topic for our press conference. I am going to be delivering after this, and I invite you to accompany me. I'm going to deliver by hand to the governor's office and then also to the attorney general's office a letter that I have sent with referrals of a number of election complaints and issues that we've identified with the conduct of Weston County Clerk Becky Hadlock, referred in accordance with Title 22 of the Election Code. In addition, I lay out a recommendation on my opinion on Becky Hadlock's removal from office. The analysis begins with Clerk Hadlock's conduct in the 2024 primary election and then proceeds to discuss the 2024 general election, culminating in the false submission of Clerk Hadlock's election audit for the general election. It is important to discuss the history of Clerk Hadlock's actions, the entire panoply of actions, to lay out the cumulative effect of her misconduct. First, on Clerk Hadlock's testing in the primary. That testing failed to comport with the requirements of 22-11-104. Weston County failed to properly seal and provide for custody of voting equipment and ballots as required by 22-12-107 and 22-12-108 in the primary. You will see in the letter, which we will hand to you after I hand deliver it to the Attorney General and the Governor, and we'll also have a press release with copies of the letter that will be emailed to you as long as you're on our list. We then proceed to Clerk Hadlock's testing in the general election, which failed to comport again with the requirements of 22-11-104. And that leads into the conduct of the general election itself. On the evening of November 5th, Clerk Hadlock submitted the unofficial election results for House District 1. According to the unofficial results for House District 1 as reported by the Weston County Clerk, Chip Nyman received 166 votes, and there were 1,289 undervotes for this office. Upon noticing the highly unusual discrepancy of undervotes for House District 1, I personally attempted to contact Clerk Hadlock via telephone shortly before midnight and reached a highly unprofessional voicemail at the Weston County Clerk's office. After multiple unsuccessful attempts to contact Clerk Hadlock via telephone, I contacted the Weston County Sheriff, Brian Colvard, directly and requested Sheriff Colvard locate Clerk Hadlock. Following this request to the Weston County Sheriff, Clerk Hadlock eventually called our office back, and when asked about the discrepancies concerning the House District 1 race, denied that there were any irregularities in the vote totals. In the days that followed the 2024 general election, the Secretary of State's office received multiple reports that Clerk Hadlock communicated to members of the public and media that the number of undervotes were not anomalous and were the natural result of a quote-unquote protest against the policy positions of Representative Nyman. I indicated my concerns with the anomalies and calls on the evening of the election, as well as the morning of November 6th, before any post-election audit had been filed with our office. Despite the expression of those concerns, Clerk Hadlock filed a false post-election audit with the Secretary of State's office. That audit is laid out 22-6-130, which requires the county clerks conduct a post-election audit of a sample size of ballots cast in the prior election and provide the results to the Secretary of State before the canvassing board convenes. Clerk Hadlock filed her post-election audit with the Secretary of State's office on November 6, 2024. Despite the anomalies communicated by myself, the audit reported audit findings of quote-unquote no issues for each ballot audited. In other words, Clerk Hadlock affirmatively indicated that she had audited the requisite number of ballots and that they matched the results that were recorded in the cast vote record. Following the verbal concerns that I had issued on both the night of November 5th as well as November 6th, the morning of November 6th, I followed up my verbal communications expressing concern with a written email on November 6th requesting a hand examination of the ballots by the county canvassing board. And all these exhibits are in the packet, so you'll see that in the email that goes out. In the days following the 2024 general election, Clerk Hadlock showed a resistance to hand counting the suspected races, reporting to individuals that no error had occurred. Responding to repeated requests by our office for a hand examination of the ballots. Ultimately, on November 7th, the county clerk and the County Clerks Association agreed to conduct a hand examination of the ballots. That occurred on the following day. And that hand count for the House District 1 race found that Nyman received 1,268 votes instead of 166 votes originally reported by Clerk Hadlock. Furthermore, the hand count uncovered that in the commissioner's race, Wagoner received 2,424 votes instead of 2,362, and Ertman received 2,163 votes instead of 2,225, as originally reported by Clerk Hadlock. It was determined through multiple phone calls with the Weston County Clerk's Office, as well as the vendor for Weston County's ballots, ES&S, that the incident in Weston County was caused by Clerk Hadlock issuing incorrectly formatted ballots to voters on election day. Pursuant to 22-6-102, the county clerk is responsible for the printing of official ballots used in the election. During the process of creating the ballots, errors or omissions resulted in 2 editions of incorrectly formatted ballots being printed and delivered to Hadlock. A third and final edition of correctly formatted ballots was subsequently printed and delivered. However, on election day, the county clerk's office mixed all 3 editions of the ballots and issued them to voters. Because the ES&S tabulators were calibrated specifically for the correctly formatted 3rd edition ballots, when ballots from the 1st and 2nd editions were scanned, the tabulators could not find the voters' selections for certain races, instead interpreting them as undervotes. As a result, the machines were only able to accurately tabulate the 3rd edition ballots that were fed into them. Clerk Hadlock ultimately admitted to making this mistake. However, the submittal of a false post-election audit report on November 6, 2024 does seem to be a willful violation of the code. This audit was supposedly performed and filed with the Secretary of State's office nearly 1 day following the 2024 general election, despite multiple questions about anomalies regarding the unofficial results communicated by myself and our office's staff. When Clerk Hadlock filed her post-election audit report indicating that there were no issues with her ballots, the Weston County Canvassing Board meeting on November 8, 2024, as well as the subsequent properly performed audit filed with our office, it was confirmed that there were 21 of 75 ballots within the audit where there was a discrepancy, in direct conflict to the initial post-election audit results submitted to our office. The second post-election audit results suggest that the first post-election audit was performed in contravention of 22-6-130 and the procedures set forth by our office. Clerk Hadlock also appears to have violated 6-5-308 when she submitted a false post-election audit report to the Secretary of State's office, which is a felony. 6-5-308A lays out that violation. Clerk Hadlock's conduct shows a pattern of gross incompetence and even willful neglect of her duties as the Chief Election Officer of Weston County. Through her errors with the 2024 primary and general election, Clerk Hadlock has shown again that repeated dereliction of those duties. Most importantly, and I want to emphasize this, we must highlight that Clerk Hadlock's conduct in filing a false post-election audit in contravention to Wyoming law indicates a repeated and heightened level of misconduct. There are only 2 reasonable explanations for the false submission of this audit, the first submission of the post-election audit. One possibility, in my mind, is that Clerk Hadlock actually conducted the audit, finding errors in the election, and then choosing to falsely assert that no errors had been found. The second reasonable possibility, in my mind, is that no audit was conducted at all. And that raises the question of whether Clerk Hadlock ever conducted a post-election audit in past elections. Either way, the submission of Clerk Hadlock's post-election audit, the first submission for the 2024 general election, was clearly false. In conclusion, I believe the standard of misconduct or malfeasance in office has clearly been met, which should subject her to removal proceeding in district court pursuant to 18-3-902. I recommend the Governor direct the Attorney General to commence removal proceedings in district court. For these reasons, again, I'm referring a number of election complaints to the Attorney General, as well as laying out the misconduct that I believe is subject to further investigation by her office and could be formally prosecuted. And again, I believe the standard of misconduct or malfeasance in office has clearly been met, and that would subject her to the removal procedure in 18-3-902. Here is the full packet with all the exhibits with a 9-page letter starting out. This will be emailed to you. I'm going to hand deliver one copy to the governor's office and one copy to the attorney general's office when we conclude this press conference, and you're welcome to accompany me as we walk here to the east and then the west to formally deliver this packet. With that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Joey Correnti, just blame Joey. I'm going to start with the clerk issue. An investigation was conducted in 2021 on the Laramie County clerk, and when submitted to the Secretary of State at the time, the answer was that election has already been certified, therefore there is no further action that can be taken. I'm assuming you don't agree with that statement based on what you just read and based on the work you've done here. Will any of those previous investigations or complaints that were dismissed by your predecessor now be looked into that also have concerns and admissions of crimes attached to them?
Well, we're continuing to evaluate statute of limitations and the Laramie County situation. However, this press conference is about the Weston County situation. And one thing I want to emphasize, a little bit off your question, and I was a little disappointed with the coverage in the Daily on this. I think it was really important to emphasize that we received the corrected totals with the hand examination of the ballots, and that's what was certified by the state canvassing board. It was not the original results that were sent incorrectly. It wasn't the incorrectly submitted first post-election audit. It was the corrected results with the hand examination that was carried out on the Friday after the election. That's what was certified by the state canvassing board. Now, I understand your question on Laramie County. That our findings here in this packet is really about Weston County.
Just to clarify, do you agree that a certification of election at the county level negates any further investigation, criminal action, absolve somebody of an issue just because it's been certified? That was the answer from your predecessor. Do you agree with that as being an answer?
Let me examine that more and get back to you on my conclusion on that. I think it's a different county, and I really want to cabin this to the Weston County situation. Thank you.
So just to clarify, you're saying you do recommend removing Clerk Hadlock from office?
Yes.
Okay.
And that procedure is laid out in Title 18. It's the governor that initiates that. But I decided in this letter, and you'll see it, we start out with the facts. That's the first part. And we do it in chronological order. So, the culmination of this was the false submission of that post-election audit. And that does come a little later in the letter, though, because I wanted to be chronological. So we start out with the 2024 primary, then we go to the 2024 general, which the testing came before the conduct of the election itself. So that's the first part of the letter, and I believe is the first 5 pages. And in the middle of page 5, we move into the referral of violations of the election code, which is a duty of the office. I can refer election complaints, refer violations of the election code, and I'm doing that with this letter and the exhibits. And then the third part is my recommendation on the removal, which is in Title 18. So it's a recommendation in the third part of the letter.
Follow up on that. There's been a lot of election complaints that have been forwarded to the AG's office, but as far as I'm aware, I don't believe she's taken any action on any that I've seen. I could be incorrect about that. But how much faith do you have that the AG's office is going to, and the governor is going to take this seriously?
Well, I'm very disappointed by the way these referrals of election complaints have been handled. There should be more follow-up from the Attorney General's office on these complaints, and the fact that there really has not been that action in terms of that communication is disappointing to me, because I want to understand what their analysis is. When I forward these complaints to the Attorney General, I want to understand a little bit of postscript on what they kind of concluded in their follow-up. So that's disappointing. One thing with this governor, and I've learned this the hard way over 7 years with him, I don't believe he is going to do anything until he does it. I've seen that from the first veto he issued back with the coal export terminal litigation. I mean, there's a lot of talk, but in terms of that follow-through, it often doesn't happen. Now, ultimately, he's got to engage this analysis himself on this. So I'm talking more about bills in what I've said, but in that previous comment. But I hope that he takes our recommendation seriously. The pattern of conduct is very, very serious. I really want to underscore that. And the submission of this false post-election audit, there really is, I mean, you think about the possibilities, and I laid it out explicitly in the letter as I did in this press conference. I really only think there's two reasonable explanations, which is either she did not conduct the audit at all, or she did conduct the audit and did not report the anomalies that were found. That's very concerning. And again, that's a submission with our office. You know, it's subject to Title VI, and that's a potential felony, that submission of that first post-election audit falsely, if it's willful. Thank you. Joey, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Back to your election integrity agenda, and congratulations, 60%. I remember some of your testimony on runoffs. 50% plus one is an undeniable win. I know there's always more to do, but with that, do you believe that 60% was a win, absolutely hands down, just with more work to do? And if so, do you agree that that win couldn't have been achieved without the support, efforts, and positive vote of the Senate?
Well, thank you, Mr. Correnti, for that question. I certainly think that it is a great step in the right direction. I would always like more to happen. And this session was an enormous opportunity. I've been in a very reflective mood the last year because I've been involved in Wyoming politics for 10 years. And I was in the legislature for 6 years, and then 2 years in the executive branch. And the insider element that controlled both houses of the legislature, the ability to get these bills done was not there at all. So this was an enormous opportunity with the conservative majority in the House. And I would have liked these bills that went through the House with huge margins, went through Senate committee, to be heard on the floor. And the decision of the Senate leadership, and it's not just Senator Nethercott, it's the entire leadership. And that is shown by when Leo asked the question of the rest of the Senate leadership, and they defended it. I just think that's really disappointing. And I think that those bills should have been heard. It was a week and a half after bills that were coming out of committee that were related to election integrity were heard on the Senate floor. And with one exception, and that's really why so many failed the last day. 7 of 15 of the bills that failed were election integrity bills. And I was listening to your podcast, and there's an explanation that there were high numbers, and they were coming out of committee at the last minute. There were bills that went through that last day that met both of those parameters. So I just really, I push back on that assertion. Yes. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on that briefly. How confident are you that the interim committee will at least take up the remaining bills and pass those and maybe hear them during the budget session next year?
Well, I want to thank both committee chairmen. They heard all those bills in committee. It was really on the floor of the Senate that we had an issue. Many were amended heavily, frankly beyond their initial scope, which was disappointing. But they were referred to the floor, and when they do those amendments, they can be debated. And so the fact that they referred those to the floor, I think that was a good sign. So that leads me to really believe that I think we're going to take these up in the interim in the Joint Corporations Committee. It's one of the reasons I'm very optimistic. And I hope that one of the ways that we handle the interim topic request from our office to look at all the failed election integrity bills is we just go through on May 5th or May 6th at that first meeting, every single one of the bills that failed. There was one on voting machine testing, House Bill 278, 278, right? That did not make it out of committee. Made it out of committee, but it did not make it out of the House floor for lack of time. That's one as well that I think needs to be revisited. That's a very well-vetted bill. We really need to improve the election testing procedures in the election code. But I think we should go through every single one of those bills that failed, wherever they were in the process that relate to election integrity, explain them, and then the committee could consider a bill drafting motion on those bills. So I feel good about it. I mean, I think it's important we work together. One of the things that really disappointed me on the election omnibus bill, which came out of the Senate, I had a conversation with President Biden about it's an omnibus bill. So if we're going to have an omnibus bill, the thought was, well, maybe let's amend other things into that bill that weren't going anywhere in the Senate. And he seemed to have no interest in that in our conversation, which was really disappointing to me because those bills were not going anywhere on the Senate side. And well, I don't like omnibuses. If that's the Senate's will to do an omnibus, why wouldn't you do an omnibus on these other matters that are of great importance on election integrity, whether it's banning ballot drop boxes or photo ID for voter ID? I mean, it's basic. So that was disappointing to me on the whole omnibus discussion. And, you know, they've done election omnibus bills in the past. I'm not a big fan of them. You know, one of the critiques is there were so many bills. Well, that's in line with our state constitution, which is to take one subject in each bill. And I think the House, that's the approach they went with. And I think for constitutional reasons, for process reasons, for focus reasons, and then ultimately for consideration by the governor, that's the way to go. Yes, Ms. Shields.
So I was curious about the interim topics, if you knew which ones would most likely be studied during the interim, because I also remember there were two different bills also regarding banning electronic voting machines that were killed both in the Senate and House committees. So I was curious if you knew which ones would be studied this interim, and if you had any priorities that you would like to see during off-season.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for the committee. I mean, I'm not the committee chairman. I'm not a legislator. I'm the chief election official for the state of Wyoming. And I believe in that role. We make recommendations. We testify. We set a vision. And I think we did all those things. And I'm really proud of that. I mean, when we put forward our election integrity vision, the next month, Megan Degenfelder did her education vision at the last moment, I think, because she saw. And she said the executive branch has been silent for too long. Well, that's what I've been saying for 3 years. It was very interesting. I don't know if you remember this, Leo. You did an article in the first session after I became Secretary of State about insiders that were saying they were offended that I was testifying on bills. It's incredible. Offended that the chief election official for the state of Wyoming is testifying on bills. I mean, Buchanan did it, not as much as I did, but I would argue that's, first of all, he did it. And second of all, that's part of the duties of the office, to engage with the construction of the election code that the Secretary of State administers on behalf of the people of the state of Wyoming. And so, and I know you were just taking sources and writing a story, okay? I get it. But it just shows the way the insiders operate and the narratives they try to construct and how it conflicts with what has happened in the past. And it's all based on whether they like you or not. You know, and that's unfortunate. We're focused on the substance. And I'm glad that Megan Degenfelder, Superintendent Degenfelder, followed our lead and went ahead and set forward a vision on education. That's I think, one of the roles of the executive branch is to set that vision and to work with the legislature on that vision. But I think the way the Joint Committee is going to take these up is, it's up to them. But what I would humbly propose is that we just sort of go through every single election integrity bill that failed at any point in the process, and then the committee could take up motions for bill drafting. And you know the process. I mean, it takes one meeting for the bill drafting motion, and then at the next meeting, they can consider that bill once it's drafted. But those bills have been drafted, and so that should be a convenient thing for the committee, because most of them have been. Now, around the edges, there's a lot of questions, and they can sort of tailor it to where they want to go. And again, that's just a suggestion, okay? That's my recommendation. But I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with the joint committee. Enjoyed our work, and I thank them for our work in the session, because both committees really did work those bills and hear those bills. It was on the floor on the Senate side where we got into issues. And then also the Senate President's desk. There were a number that were held in his desk. Although I'm sure, and I want to make sure to caveat this, his excuse will probably be that they were in the omnibus, but we talked about the omnibus. And all the time, bills that have gone through the House that are almost identical or nearly identical to the Senate, all the time, both houses take them up on both sides. It's sort of a common convention. So to say that, well, we're not going to take it up on this side because it's over there, I mean, that happens all the time, that they come up on both sides. So that was disappointing. I think it should have been given a run, having them not only in the omnibus approach, but the approach of different bills.
On the point of giving your testimony and giving your input on bills to that effect, how many bills did you help write this session? I've asked you a few times.
I know you love this question. It's a fascinating question because, I mean, first of all, Leo, and remember this as a legislator, all the bills have to go through drafting through LSO. So, I mean, one way to answer that is, in final form, all of them are going through that procedure, which is LSO doing it. Now, I engage all the time on ideas, on executing the code, improvements in the code. I don't have a number. I mean, all the time we talk about it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean in a specific instance that we drafted the specific language, but even if that happened in certain instances, and I don't have every single one, in my mind, what's wrong with that we're talking about specific language? That's when you look at the code, it's not just the theory. You come up with an idea, and voter ID is near and dear to my heart. It's the lead on it, 21, House Bill 75. There were things that came on in the back end that, in order to get it in the green books, they were amendments that weakened it, that passed on the floor. And it was something that was accepted at the time. But our intent was always that we were going to strengthen it on the back end, always. So when you think about photo ID for voter ID, the student ID bill, House Bill 206 and House Bill 160, those were bills that we're thinking about back in 2021. But the language was, the final form was conducted by LSO. And so that communication from the state's chief election official and legislators on thinking about specific language and how we would effectuate these ideas that are not only in my mind, but in every single conservative legislator's mind. I wasn't the only one when that amendment passed on House Bill 75 in 2021, allowing for IDs that didn't have photos on them. I was not the only one that was disappointed. We were all talking about it. And so we engage in thinking about specific language. A lot of times legislators will have these ideas and then draft it with LSO, and I'll look at the language and give my feedback. That happens all the time. It happens with the superintendent as well. But we're just doing good work, and every day I tell our guys, we need a 3-yard run up the middle at least. And
so would it be fair to say you gave input on a significant amount of bills? Would that be fair to say?
yeah, what's wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with that? I gave input in committee testimony on all of them. I think, a couple times Joe, Mr. Rubino filled in my absence, and Mr. Naaman a couple times. But so yeah, I filled all through testimony. I definitely did that, and that's the process. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Parenti.
I try to choke down my personal disappointment not being asked how many of these bills I helped write, but that notwithstanding, looking into the future, we're halfway to the next census. This year, a bill was passed talking about constitutional apportionment. I know this is outside of the agenda you talked about, but it does have to do with elections. Are you looking at being involved in that task force, that conversation? Do you have any position on the constitutional apportionment of the legislature in Wyoming?
That's another bill on the governor's desk. I don't know, did he sign it today, or I guess not, but it's on his desk. I definitely think we need to handle it. I testified in support of it throughout the process. It's another example, I'm getting to Mr. Wolfson's question. We had really good conservative freshman legislators that were excited about election integrity. And they wanted to address these issues, and we engaged in a dialogue with them in many instances. And this was another bill that there was a lot of interest on because it's something that needs to be handled. I wasn't satisfied with redistricting in 2022. It was the last vote I cast as a Wyoming legislator, and cast a no, and was really upset about the way it went that last night for a lot of reasons, and this was one of them. And so I think it's absolutely important we engage in that process. I think we should also look at a test case. I was a little disappointed in the final drafting of the bill. I don't think that language made it in there, but it more says a process that would align with the legal precedent at the federal level and then also at the state level. And there are a few ways you could adhere to both. I would have liked also to examine the test case, but that wasn't in the final drafting. And so I think the committee will look at those other options that were laid out in the committee, and a decision will be made. It'll be interesting to see whether Management Council chooses a select committee on that or assigns it to a standing committee. I believe the bill does mention, I think it says assigned to a committee. I don't know if it's somewhat agnostic on whether a committee could be created. I expressed this in testimony. I'm a little bit concerned on the workload of the Joint Corporations Committee that, that this could, do we need extra meetings? Because we want to make sure to get to the other items, and it's not just elections. There's also insurance and utility work, stopping these outrageous increases from Rocky Mountain Power, just outrageous. And I want to express we had this hearing today, my total opposition to what they're doing, Rocky Mountain Power. But anyway, there's a lot to do in the Joint Corporations Committee. Again, this is just my concern I've laid out also in testimony on the workload, but I think the Speaker and the Senate President and the Management Council will debate that here on April 8th, April 7th meeting in the ceremonial signing, in the Constitutional Signing Chamber right above us.
And to clarify your question, the Management Council of the Wyoming Legislature shall assign a committee of the legislature to study the apportionment as provided by this during the 2020.
Yeah, that's an interesting memo. What's a committee of the legislature? Is that a select committee or is that a standing committee only? That'll be an interesting debate.
The only thing that's clear is the time frame during
Right.
the 2025 interim.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting memo from the LSO. But I won't be able to see it because it's privileged. But I'm sure they'll have that discussion, and it'll be interesting. So. Yes, go ahead.
You were talking about you're disappointed that the governor hasn't signed some of these bills into law or taken action on them that are on his desk. But he does have 15 days to do so. Why is it important that he take action quickly, rather than using the 15 days of allotted time? Because at the end of the day, if he passes them into law, it's still going to go into effect on the same day for most of them. So, yeah.
Well, I've always wondered this because most of them had a deadline of 11:59 p.m. Thursday. So it was unclear up to about 1:30 p.m. Thursday, even past that, whether they were going to extend the day. So I assume from a workload perspective, he had a plan if they did decide to extend, how he was going to handle that. But he did sign 337, which actually had a deadline, I believe, of Friday at 11:59 p.m. under the 72 hours, if they had stayed in session. So some of us were a little concerned about that. Obviously, it's his prerogative. Maybe he thought that one was a little clearer in his mind, although in his comments afterward, he actually read this sort of cryptic statement where he expressed some reservations about it, which was very interesting. I don't know if you were in the room at that time. But it was a very clear-cut piece of legislation, banning foreign funding on ballot measures and closing the loophole in federal law that the FEC, in a weird decision, created. And we're the second state in the nation to do that. It's a huge bill. I want to thank Representative Weber. I want to thank all the legislators that sponsored these bills, worked on these bills. It's a tremendous effort. But yeah, it raises questions because there were bills that had an earlier deadline, meaning 156, and then bills that had the same deadline, 318, 165, 228, that were not signed at that signing ceremony. So the question is why? And then also, I've always been fascinated by this workload question. I guess he just kind of assumes that probably they're going out because that was the original schedule, but it was not clear. My gut was they were going to go out too, but he probably had a backup plan. He had letters sort of prepared, but then the question is, if you have the letters prepared, why don't we just make a decision? Just get it done with. I mean, he had 7 hours as of 2 p.m., 10 hours as of 2 p.m. And what time did they make that announcement? Do you remember? It was right after lunch. It was about 2:33. I mean, that's when I heard it. It wasn't clear to me up to that point. So, if you have 7-8 hours, and I assume you already have a letter prepared one way or another, why don't we it would have been nice to maybe have a decision. I don't know what the process is. A very interesting deal, when you have a 72 hours abutting the last day of the scheduled session. Well, thank you very much. You are welcome to follow me. I am going to hand deliver these 2 packets, and then I know there's a couple that want to do post interviews, and then we will here this afternoon have a press release with the full packet. I believe Mr. Rubino has about 10 copies of the letter or so. How many copies of the letter do you have, Mr. Rubino? Okay, so we have the letter. The exhibits are not in there, okay? I mean, we're talking, this is a full packet. So the exhibits will be in the email that goes out here this afternoon. I believe you're all on the list. So. Very well. Well, I am going to head over to the east side first, to the governor's office. You're welcome to follow me, and then I'll deliver to the Attorney General. Thank you.